Hey, so in this talk, I'm going to be discussing how to make progress and really learn something in spite of perfectionism. The perfectionism is something that can really hinder our progress. It can stop us from even attempting something new, and certainly can slow us down tremendously. So I'll be looking at some of what creates this, how we maintain it internally, and then some of the things you can do to keep moving forward in spite of it. So I think for many people, perfectionism can be experienced as a need to get things right, a need to get things at a certain standard before there's a willingness to try something or to put it out in the world. And I think at times it may be a bit of a misnomer because I think the need to be perfect is really speaks to a need to not experience criticism. And I think this gets at the root of how uh, we experience perfectionism as a cognitive process. In my experience, it can happen in two different ways. Sometimes I'll be thinking of doing something or making an attempt at something, and I have a running internal critique going on. I may be criticizing what I'm doing, judging it, comparing it to a really high standard. So it's an internalized critique. And it may be in my own voice, or it may be a critic that I've internalized. It could be a teacher or a parent, something like that. I think that's one of the main ways that people sort of do perfectionism. The other way is where when we're imagining the response from a potential audience or source of where we're going to share our work. And again, I want to point out that it's an imagined response because we don't really know, like if I make a drawing, I don't know how that drawing is going to be received until I put it out in the world and see somebody's response. And yet we imagine how people will respond to things. And this hinders the willingness to just try things. So what can we do about that? So I want to talk about these two different modes of internal critique and what we can do about that, and then a couple other strategies that can help you keep moving in spite of perfectionism. So when you have a strong internal critic, whether where you might be critiquing yourself or hearing the voice of somebody critiquing you, the first thing I would recommend with that is to externalize it to a degree. So what you would do is take out a piece of paper, take out your journal, and when you're thinking of making something and you notice this internal critique, write it down so you can at least experience it as coming from the outside. And then you can look at it and be a little bit more objective and decide, is it something that you agree with or don't agree with? Is it something you'd like to expand? This is something I've talked about in other videos. Sometimes we need to update our internal critic to more of an internal coach, somebody who has our back. So write down whatever phrases are commonly used internally, and then begin to respond to those. Is this something I agree with or I don't agree with? And how can I move forward in spite of this? Now, when it comes to an imagined audience, what I would recommend again is a form of externalization, which is instead of imagining how an audience would respond, is there a trusted friend or somebody that you can go to so that you can get actual feedback in the world as you're creating something? So I'm not suggesting that you write a piece of music and go to Carnegie Hall with no preparation and perform, because then it's really a crapshoot. You don't know what kind of response you'll get. But instead, if you're working on a piece of music, for example, you could play it for a bunch of individuals and get feedback along the way, so that you can see, is it meeting my own standards? And what's the type of response that it's eliciting from different people? So you want to externalize that imagined audience and put real faces to the feedback so that you can respond to it and over time improve what you're doing. A couple other things you can do to make progress in spite of perfectionism. One is to do what I call micro studies. So I was just talking about enlisting sort of trusted advisors to get feedback. And instead of maybe getting feedback on a whole piece, maybe you zero in on one aspect for a while. Maybe if we're talking about this piece of music, maybe you spend some time really focusing on melody and just get feedback on that one moment. The other thing you can do is begin to work in batches of work. So instead of making one drawing and then critiquing yourself or showing it to people, if you set up your work such that, okay, I'm going to make 30 drawings, or I'm going to make at least 10, and I'm going to do my best to defer judgment until I've done 10. And the nice thing about that is, first of all, it frees you up from self-judgment along the way to some degree. And you can learn so much by the continuum of all 10. You can see what sort of progress is made between the first drawing and the 10th. And you can see what sort of trends you notice. You may also notice places where you really want to focus and improve. So doing your work in batches can be a tremendous way of creating forward movement. And what I notice is whenever I work in batches, after I do 10 of something, I start thinking, oh, I wonder how it's going to be after I do another 10 and another 10. So it really creates some forward momentum for me. Now, the last thing I'll say, sort of builds on this idea of a test audience. And it's really trying to determine what are environments that you're comfortable testing. Who are people whose taste you respect and that you feel are, perhaps kind enough and tough enough at the same time that their input would be useful for you? Or is there a community? In writing, a lot of people write in groups. They become part of a writing team so that you're getting feedback from multiple people. And over time, any piece of feedback stops being devastating. And it's just that, it's feedback. It's like, well, I'm a little bit off course. I need to course correct. So I hope these things help you get into movement instead of letting perfectionism just stop you in your tracks. And as always, I'd love to hear your comments about that.